let's talk about liminality and what that means and why that's important to shamanism. Hi, my name is John Moore, and I am a shamanic practitioner and teacher. I live in the state of Maine in the US, and the northeast of the US, if you don't know where that is. And today I want to talk to you about the liminal, and that might be a word that you may not be familiar with. It's not one that is often used in the English language. It's pretty uncommon. And what liminal means is it means bordering or space that's between things. Okay? And how liminality, which is the quality of being liminal, applies to shamanism happens in different ways. And it is a really important concept to grasp in anyone's study of shamanism, if you are studying shamanism, learning shamanism. And so it's really important to understand the importance of liminality. So we think of liminality in terms of spaces, usually physical spaces, right? A liminal space might be standing in the door frame. You're neither quite in the house or out of the house. Or you might have 1 foot in the house and 1 foot out of the house. So you'd be experiencing liminality of the space. You might be on a border between things, right? So you might be standing straight in the border. If you've ever been to the American Southwest, there's a spot called the Four Corners where the corners of 4 states touch, and you can stand on this spot and you're standing in 4 states at the same time. So from a legal jurisdiction perspective, that would be a liminal space. The other things that can be liminal are states of consciousness, which are, we can sort of hang on to these in-between spaces. So a good example of that is the time between being awake and the time between being asleep, and the same time going the other direction between being asleep and being awake. Very rarely do we go from wakefulness to sleep. We just pass out and fall asleep, or from being fully asleep to being fully awake, like in an instant. It does happen, right? For me, I have twin daughters, and when they first came home from the hospital, I didn't sleep for about 3 or 4 days, and I decided to go to work and was passing out at my computer. So I was going, there was no liminality there, or the liminal space between awake and sleep was very limited. And then we've all been startled out of a deep sleep into wakefulness in an emergency situation, or a loud noise goes off. For me, the fire alarm in my house malfunctioned and went off, and I'll tell you, I got out of bed pretty quick and made sure the house wasn't on fire. So those are liminal spaces in consciousness, and the one between when you're going from wakefulness to sleep, there's a period of time that's called the hypnagogic state, in which we're kind of half in and half out of sleep, right? As we transition into sleep, there is a time you can do work in that space where maybe you're repeating an affirmation or something that you want to go into your subconscious. This is also a time where you can sometimes program your dream state a little bit. You can work on seeding dreams in that space. And then the state when you're going from sleep to wakefulness and you're sort of half in and half out is called the hypnopompic state. And during these times, during the hypnagogic state and the hypnopompic state, which are sort of unique brain states, very frequently people have waking dreams. We might consider them hallucinations, but we might also consider them as a time where we have sort of pierced the veil, which is a common esoteric term. So they talk about there being this metaphorical veil drawn between the physical world and the spiritual world. And sometimes that veil is thinner. So there are liminal times, like Halloween is one, right? Samhain for the Celts was a liminal time between summer and fall, or summer and winter, right? And so that was a time when the veil between worlds was also thinned, and the spirits of the dead could come back. And we've turned Halloween into what it is, but it was celebrated by bonfires and feasting, and they would set out a meal to departed ancestors, which is common in a lot of different cultures. So that's a liminal time. We've talked about liminal space. We've talked about liminal states of consciousness. We've talked about liminal time. Another liminal space that's important to some types of folk magic, this isn't a thing that's particular to shamanism, is crossroads. So you'll very often, with things like voodoo or hoodoo, find instructions for doing certain things at a crossroads, certain rituals at crossroads. And there's the old story of meeting the devil at the crossroads, right? Because that was considered liminal space, where two roads crossed each other. And there's a spot at the crossroads where you are in both roads at the same time, right? When you stand in the middle of that is a liminal space. Now, if you have done any sort of studying around shamanism and have Googled it or looked up images of shamans and that sort of thing, you will most likely come up with images of people from different cultures, most notably Siberia, Mongolia, that area of the world, but in other places as well. And those people are will often wear headdresses that will include something called a shamanic eye shade or eye mask. And that is usually a fringed mask that hangs down. So you have like a headband, and then there's fringe that hangs down, pieces of leather. Sometimes it's beaded strings, whatever. So it's a little bit like, if you remember those beaded curtains from the 1970s, it's a little bit like that hanging down in front of the eyes. There are a couple of reasons why this is an important shamanic tool. And in my own practice, we are instructed to create our own shamanic eye shade for ritual work and for journey work. One of the reasons is when you put the eye shade on, your eyes are obscured, but you can still see some of the outside world. So you automatically enter into a liminal state, and it informs your state of mind. The other reason why shamans in different cultures wear some sort of eye shade is that frequently when they're entranced and often merged with a spirit, the idea is if you look into their eyes, you can receive such a fright that it can cause soul loss. And so they're covering their eyes for that reason. But the main reason, from my perspective, is to help one enter into the liminal space of the shamanic state of consciousness. Now, shamans are always walk in both worlds, right? So they're not just spirit workers, but they work in the real world. The spirit world is real. It's just, we think of the physical world as the real world. But they work in both the spiritual world and the physical world, and that's really important. It's really important to have a foot in both worlds. Being completely absorbed in the spirit world is okay in some senses, and there are times to do that. But shamans are called upon to bring healing and knowledge down into this world. So they're, one way to think about this is the job is to go out and bring the light into this world. And if you think about the story of Prometheus bringing fire from the gods to humans, well, that's a really shamanic story, as many of our myths refer to shamanic practices. It's, ascending to the upper worlds where the gods live, stealing fire from them and bringing that down to humanity to impart a blessing on humanity. Of course, Prometheus was punished for eternity for doing that, but that was important work. And going into the underworld and retrieving people or retrieving spirits is a common theme in myths as well. Descent into the underworld and return. Look at Empire Strikes Back. George Lucas was following the pattern of the hero's journey, which I would argue is all about shamanic initiation. When Luke Skywalker goes down and fights what he thinks is Darth Vader, and spoiler alert, but this movie is, more than 30 years old at this point. And he strikes down Darth Vader, and Darth Vader's mask blows apart, and it's Luke Skywalker's face inside the mask. And so he's been going into the underworld to fight with his own shadow during this time. Could not be a clearer example of shamanic work in cinema that I can think of. Alice in Wonderland maybe a little bit, but this is a very heavy shamanic theme, descending into the underworld, fighting the shadow, fighting one's demons to realize that we are our own demons. So again, our myths are full of stories of liminal spaces. So we have the river Styx, right, in the underworld, that one has to cross, and you have to pay the ferryman Charon to get to the other side. The crossing over the crossing over stories of the Bardo in Tibetan Buddhism. If you read Tibetan Book of the Dead, if you read the Egyptian Book of the Dead, crossing over, there are all of these things that we have to cross through in trials and tribulations. And all of those are liminal because they're between our life and our afterlife, and what sort of happens there. So this is a really important concept to grasp when you're studying shamanism, because we tend to live in those spaces. But there's lots of when we look to folk magic as well. And folk magic can be anything from voodoo to Wicca to other forms of witchcraft to indigenous magic, that sort of thing. So folk magic, which is it's not a pejorative, it's not putting it down, it's just applying a label that this is not high ceremonial magic, performed in temples. It's performed by people for everyday reasons. There are lots of things with portals, with like door frames, like hanging a broom over the door, hanging a horseshoe over the door, hanging in Jewish people put a mezuzah in door frames. Again, it's about protecting our boundaries, protecting our liminal space. But there's lots of spellcraft that goes along with that as well. So I just wanted to touch upon this concept a little bit because I think it's really important to learn about and explore if you're learning shamanism. Please subscribe to my channel. I've got a couple links below. One is a link to my website if you want to learn more about me. And another one is a link to a shamanic community if you're a person who practices shamanism and would benefit from regular contact with like-minded individuals all over the world. Live events like journey circles and even social events. Definitely give it a click and check it out. And I will talk to you very soon.